Today we're going to be looking at the results of the struggle of Yaakov with the mysterious Ish, who wrestles with him in the Parsha, and we're going to try to see what that represents. Right? Rashi brings down from Chazal that is what's called Saro Shel Esav, the Malach, the spiritual force that is in charge of the nation of Esav. And Chazal explained that that is actually the Yetzer Hara himself, that force, that negative force. Now, just stepping back a second, how did that happen? Esav had potential. Esav could have partnered with Yaakov, but when Esav chose to devote himself to opposition of everything that Yaakov represented, he became so unified with that opposing force that's in the universe that is the force of Esav and his nation. So therefore, when we look at the commentaries, at the struggles between Yaakov and Esav, and the Sar of Esav, it's viewed as a meta struggle between good and evil, between Hashem's plan for the world and the opposition to the plan for the world. And we're supposed to be able to learn about this, even down to the very struggle that goes on inside of ourselves, because we have this. So we see that there's an attack over here, and we have to understand why this attack happens at this time. It tells us Yaakov was left alone. Vayivosar Yaakov levado. He was alone. And Rashi brings down from Chazal that he went back to get pachim ktanim. Pachim, in the language of Chazal, represents earthenware flasks. Earthenware flasks were incredibly common, incredibly cheap. Okay, and that was the time that this struggle began. Yavek Ishimo, and Yaakov Avinu was victorious. At the end, so the Malach says the following. He says, Shalcheni ki Allah hashachar. Send me because dawn has broken. The morning has come. And Yaakov asks him, insists, Lo ashalecha chokim berachtani. I will not send you. I will not let you go until you give me a bracha. And then we have this name change. Vayomer Elov mashmecha. Malach says, what is your name? Strange, as if he wouldn't know. Vayomer lo Yaakov omer od shimcha ki im Yisrael. Your name will no longer be Yaakov, but Yisrael. Ki sarisar Elohim ve'im anoshim v'tuchal. Because you strove and succeeded and ruled over also divine powers, meaning me, a Malach, an angel, and with human beings, and you succeeded. Okay, now Rashi says, the Malach told him, you have to let me go because today I have to sing in the heavens. It's my day. He pulled out his Google Calendar. He showed him, right, he had singing duty at that time. So there's a very famous piece in the Sefer Avodas Yisrael from the Kozhnitzer Maggid asking, why did the Malach have to sing particularly that day? It can't be coincidence. So he explains that a Malach only says Shira to Hashem when it fulfills that which it was created for. The very word Malach, which is the equivalent of Shliach, which means an emissary, an emanation of Hashem's will, this creation exists only for its mission. Right? That's why when Am Yisrael said, Nasev Nishma, we will do and we will hear, meaning whatever it is, that's us. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu praised them. He says, you use the language of Malachim at that point. Now, different Malachim sing at different times, all depending on their mission. So the Sar Shel Esav, the Malach behind the nation of Esav, is what's called the Samach Mem. Okay? Now, this is the Malach name for the Yetzer Hara. We have to distinguish Judaism from Christianity. Again, I'm not an expert in all the flavors of Christianity, but this concept of the devil or the Satan as some independent operator who fights against God is not us. Right? The Yetzer Hara is a Malach created by Hashem for the purposes of his creation. His mission is to oppose Hashem's plan and those who are bringing that plan into fruition. And that's where this particular song comes from. It says the Malach of Esav is the Yetzer Hara, the Satan, that prosecutor, that opponent, who was created to get a person to move from the path he should be going on. The very name with Samach Mem means to blind people's eyes. Nonetheless, if you would look deeply into this Malach, this angel, the Yetzer Hara, he doesn't really want a person to listen to him. He really doesn't want that person to do evil, because deep inside, he is a creation of Hashem's purposes, and Hashem's purposes are good. So how does this work? He says he has a job. He's created to try to destroy that which is good, to destroy people, to destroy human beings, and that's what it's for. Hashem created him that way, but Hashem creates things that are good. So he brings a famous parable that the Zohar HaKadosh brings to try to explain this. You have a king who is trying to bring up his son to be the next royal prince, to be the next king, and he tells him, you have to understand, you are royal, you cannot be spending time with all sorts of cheap women. You have to marry a royal princess who will be fitting to be the queen. Do you understand? He says, yes, father, I do understand. The king then calls up the most talented prostitute in the nation and says, I want you to seduce my son. And he says, I will reward you greatly, I will pay you greatly for this job. Now, why is the king doing this? The king wants his son to refuse. So this prostitute has two missions. On one hand, she's been hired to use her talents and abilities and all that she has to try to seduce the king's son. But she herself will be sad if the son gives in to her. She knows that the king will be happier with the entire mission and will reward her greater if he refuses, because that's the point of the entire mission. Therefore, he says, the Yetzer Hara comes and does its best to destroy us spiritually, physically, to separate us from the things we should be doing, from our true selves. But the Yetzer Hara, deep inside, wants that simply to bring us to activate our potential, to become who we're able to become, and to become more good, and to bring more good in the world. I saw in one of the Sfarim I was looking at, he said that this is actually the Pshat in Al-Chet that we say on Yom Kippur. One of the Al-Chets is Al-Chet shechatonu lefanecha b'Yetzer Hara. Because of the Chet that we have done with the Yetzer Hara, here he explains it to the Yetzer Hara. He says, on Yom Kippur, when you're thinking of everything, you have to realize you torture the Yetzer Hara. By you giving in to the Yetzer Hara, you bring him great pain. He says, think about that as well on Yom Kippur. It's a fascinating perush. So here, this Malach has never said Shira. This Malach, there are Malachim who have short-range missions. This Malach has a very long-range mission, opposing Yaakov and his descendants and all of what they stand for. And here, no one had defeated this Malach in the way that Yaakov did. Yaakov Avinu defeated the Malach in a way, and we'll try to define what this is, that a certain decisive victory was won. Now wait a second, the world didn't suddenly start playing the music for the end of the movie, right, and move on to the next stage. And the Yetzer Hara is still with us and there. So we'll have to see what that victory was. But here, when the victory happened, when the Malach was defeated, the Malach said, now it's time for me to sing. Now is the time for me to sing, and that was happening at that point. So this is a fascinating picture for us of the different ways of looking at ourselves, the different levels of ourselves, because we have inside of ourselves the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara. And sometimes we think that at least when we're going along with the Yetzer Hara, there's a certain harmony, and the Yetzer Hara is cheering us on. But deep inside, sometimes we can even feel the pain and disappointment of the Yetzer Hara, of the fact that we didn't let him sing, or the fact that we gave into that. So now, our next step is to try to figure out how Yaakov defeated him, and what they were fighting about. Okay, this was not simply a mugging. There had to be an issue that was going on here. There had to be something that was at stake. So the Shem Shmuel explains how the victory happened, and explains what the Malach deep inside was meant to bring about. He brings from the Medrash, Rabbi Shimon said, Ma dichsi vayomer shalcheni. Isn't it strange that the Malach says to Yaakov, send me, let me go? A Malach is this spiritual entity, right? It's hard to imagine Yaakov getting some kind of headlock on the Malach that he can't fly off and do whatever he would do. He says, "Hamashalech gadol min hamishtalech." This shows that Yaakov was greater, was more powerful than the Malach who needed to be sent. Now he quotes, he says, many of the Rishonim feel that a Malach is on a higher level than a human being, in a certain sense. Those will be qualified in a second. But I don't think that's hard for us to understand. If you think about the story in Tanakh, where Shimshon's parents saw the Malach and they felt that they were going to die just because they saw a Malach, right? Let's erase from our heads the pictures from the greeting cards of little, chubby babies with wings or something wishing you a happy birthday or Valentine's Day or something. A Malach is an incredibly powerful force that's not limited by our physical limitations. So somehow here Yaakov, a human being, reached a level of mastery and magnitude that was greater than the Malach. So he brings the following. He quotes the Sefer Sharei Ora, an early Sefer of Kabbalah, that says, you have to realize, a Malach also has body and soul. Okay? It's hard for us to imagine what that is, but I think it's also a simple equation. Only Hashem is non-corporeal and infinite. Only about Hashem we say, Ein lo demus haguf ve'ein lo guf. He has no body, he has nothing like a body. So therefore, a Malach is not infinite. A Malach is not everywhere. There's some type of finite definition of that Malach. That finite definition is the guf of the Malach, what you could call the body of the Malach. And the Malach has its spiritual life force that enables it to do everything that it is. So he says, when you have a face-off between a human being and the Malach, the body of the Malach is infinitely more powerful than the body of a human being. The body of a human being is flesh and blood, is very limited material. Whatever this body is of the Malach, it's far more powerful than a human being. However, in the soul, in terms of the Neshama of a human being is far more powerful than that of the Malach. The Neshama comes from mitachas kisei hakavod, the Neshama of Am Yisrael. That means that Hashem's throne will not exist in the world but through Am Yisrael. That is their Neshama. And we are called Bonim Atim LaHashem Elokechem. We are children of Hashem. Inside of us is a Chelek Elokam Imal, of incredible closeness to Hashem. So therefore, the ability to defeat a Malach depends on how you define yourself. If a human being is body-centered, so then, if he has to face a Malach, it's hopeless. He's going to lose. But if a human being defines their true essence as the Neshama, if that's how they identify themselves, and the body is that car that drives them around, it's the horse that the Neshama rides, then this being, this human being who is Neshama dominant, becomes master over the Malach, and the Malach that's most important for us in our struggles is the Yetzer Hara. So therefore, he says, this is what Yaakov was able to do. Now, how do we do it? It's very nice that Yaakov Avinu was able to do it, but we have a Yetzer Hara too that we have to wrestle with. And it's hard for us to look at anything here in the Psukim and any techniques of spiritual martial arts that Yaakov had that we can follow. But he says you have to realize, this idea of becoming Neshama dominant as opposed to Guf, body dominant, is actually fairly basic. If your Avodat Hashem, if the way you serve Hashem is done lackadaisically, without effort, the word for it in Hebrew is hitrashlut or hisrashlus, depending on how you pronounce it. Okay, what that means is you are doing things, you're even doing mitzvahs, but you're doing them with a very low battery. You're doing them in a way that's comfortable to your physical self. You're not pushing the envelope. You're not doing anything that feels difficult or unnatural to you. He says when a person is doing that, even though they're doing admirable Jewish things, and they may be rewarded for doing those Jewish things, they'll certainly be rewarded for them, but you've not transformed yourself. Your neshama has not been awakened. You haven't worked with it yet. But im oved b'koach gadol lamala mikfi tivo, if you work with a great strength beyond what would naturally come to you, v'hergelo, you go against habits. That's one of the most powerful battles a person can fight, is to overcome a habit. B'zeh ma'orer koach haneshama. When you serve Hashem in that way, suddenly the neshama is awakened, and then, right, if you do that, the opposition to you cannot stand up to you. And he says it can be in a very simple, small thing. Chazal say in the Gemara, Eino dome hashone pirko mea pa'amim l'shone pirko mea pa'amim ve'echos. You cannot compare someone who learned their piece of Torah 100 times, they reviewed it 100 times, to someone who reviewed it 101 times. They said the person who did it 100 times, that's what's called asher lo avado. He didn't really serve Hashem. The one who served Hashem, who reviewed it 101 times, that person is truly a servant of Hashem. Okay, let's try to figure this out. The 100 times, which sounds pretty good to us, right, which is there, it's talking... yeah, in 4. Okay, so that represents an idea. That's what this person usually does. We're talking about, that happens to be this person's way of learning. He reviews his material 100 times, and then he goes on. But when he steps out of his habit, even such an admirable habit, and he does it 101 times, suddenly he's become a different human being. Years ago, I heard Rabbi Shusters, the famous Yerushalmi Maggid, and he was telling us this chazal, this description in the Gemara. He says, let me just explain to you realistically how that plays out in our world. 2 people are sitting and learning, chavrusa, and it comes time that the chavrusa should be over. Let's say it's lunchtime in the yeshiva at 1 o'clock. So they have 2 options. Most people, you hear the slam of the Gemara closing, and everybody thundering off to get online for lunch. This chavrusa, they happen to say, okay, so let's just go over what we saw today. We saw the machlokes of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, right? We went over the Rashi. We saw Tosfos' question on Rashi. Tosfos' answer, we still didn't understand that much. We got to go over that again tomorrow. And that's what we did this morning. And then they closed their Gemara. Reb Shalom said, those people are on a different planet. Just with that 2 minutes, that 2 minutes stepping away from the habit, that was the neshama becoming dominant. And those people are more powerful than malachim. At that moment, you're more powerful than a malach.
Because they changed the hergel.
Correct. They changed the hergel even in such a little way. So therefore, he says, this is the power of who we are and what we're supposed to do. Now, there are different times that help us. He says, Shabbos is really a time that you're supposed to be neshama dominant. This whole concept of the neshama yesera, it's called in the Sfarim Yom HaNishmasa, the day of the neshama. It says that is when it's a gift, where you have that. That's why we're ordering around the malachim. Shalom aleichem, malachei asharis, malachei elyon. We're the boss. We're the host. The malachim are dancing around us because Shabbos gives us that power, the neshama yesera. And the neshama yesera is supposed to be felt in the fact that we're more neshama dominant on that day. We're so neshama dominant, and it's a fascinating thing. Rashi Maseches Beitza gives a very strange definition of the neshama yesera. He says it's the ability to eat more and drink more without the neshama being like disgusted by it. That's the neshama yesera, right? And it's strange that Shabbos is such a physical day. Everything physical about Shabbos is holy, from buying the food, to cooking the food, to eating the food, to taking a shower, to wearing nice clothes. Why would we have such a physical day on our most spiritual day? Because that's the day that the equation is right. Since you're neshama dominant, then you're able to utilize all the physical things in the world the way they're meant to be. And instead of them limiting you or bringing you down, you elevate them. He says that's one time when we can do it. I will mention, since it's the season, that there's another time, which is the lighting of Ner Chanukah. And we'll speak more about that in a second. The Arizal said that these pachim ktanim, these small vessels, the word pach kicks off in our head the association with the little bottle of oil, which bottle is a poor translation. This pach was also a little earthenware container of oil. The Arizal says that is what Yaakov Avinu went back for. That's the pach, traveled through history. We'll have to explain this in a little bit, what and why that's there. But Chanukah is a time, at the time of lighting Ner Chanukah, that is when we are Neshama dominant. There's a story they say about a person who brought a kvittel. He brought a note to the Chozeh of Lublin about a certain person. And the Chozeh looked at it and he started like coughing and hacking as if he was going to be sick just seeing the name of the person. And the man who brought the note was rather frightened. And he had come to the Chozeh for Chanukah, so he thought he would try again. And he brought the Chozeh the note. And the Chozeh looked at it and he said, this person, he said in Yiddish, scheint in alle Oilemas. He's shining and glowing light in all the worlds. And he says, but this is the same name I brought. He says, at this moment he's lighting Ner Chanukah. At this moment he's lighting Ner Chanukah. Ner Chanukah, that Ner which comes, that light, and we'll explain more in a bit, is the dominant Neshama, and it's one of the huge opportunities for every Jew, because wherever they are, in Golus, in any place that they are, to be able to glow and grow in that way. Okay, so now let's try to see what they were arguing about. What was going on when they argued? One aspect is in the two versions of the name change. The Malach, who again is designed to fight, and Chazal tell us, Yitzru shel Adam mischadeh shova b'chol yom. The Yetzer renews itself every day, and that's because we have more and more potential that has to be activated and actualized. So here too with Yaakov, even with the defeat, look at the fast one he tried to pull. He tells him, Vayomer Elov Mashmecha. He said, what's your name? Vayomer Yaakov. He said, my name's Yaakov. Vayomer Lo Yaakov Yomer Od Shimcha. Your name will not be said anymore as Yaakov, Ki im Yisrael. Your name is now Yisrael. Ki sarisa im Elohim v'im anoshim v'tuchal. Because you defeated your spiritual enemies, you defeated your human enemies. Later, Hashem does the name change. Okay? Later on in the Parsha, Vayero Elohim el Yaakov od bevo mipadan aram vayevarechoso. This is happening in Beit El. Vayomer Elohim Shimcha Yaakov. Hashem says, your name is Yaakov. Lo yikareh Shimcha od Yaakov. Your name will no longer be called Yaakov. Ki im Yisrael yeshmecha. Yisrael will be your name. Vayikra eshmo Yisrael. Now the Gemara points out a fascinating thing. Avram Avinu, his name was changed from Avram to Avraham. To the extent that the Gemara says you should never call Avraham Avram. The Torah declared that that's his name, and that is now the name change. And the question is, why is it not true for Yaakov? We see in these psukim very clearly stating that his name was changed to Yisrael, and yet we refer to him all the time by both, by either Yaakov and Yisrael. So the Gemara certainly says we see the evidence that it's used, right, that it's there, so both names do exist, and therefore we can follow in that. But what was going on? So if you pay attention, the Malach told him, your name will be only Yisrael. It says you will no longer be Yaakov, you will be Yisrael. Hashem told him, Shimcha Yaakov, your name is Yaakov. So what is the name change? It's no longer exclusively Yaakov. Now you will be both Yaakov and Yisrael. The Yetzer Hara wanted him suddenly now to be only Yisrael and not Yaakov. So this is one level of the battle. He says, okay, you are now on an exalted level. You have defeated the most powerful spiritual entity opposing you. You are now not like other human beings. You are a spiritual master. No longer Yaakov, the one who's in this world, with this world, struggling, doing. You're something else. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him the answer, no. He says, you have to be both. Reb Mendel of Kosov says, this is the life of a Jewish tzaddik. A Jewish tzaddik can reach dveikus, connection to Hashem, but he has to follow the pathway of Moshe Rabbeinu. It says Moshe Rabbeinu went down min hahar el ha'am. He went down from Har Sinai to being that Ish Elokim, to living that supernatural existence, to come down and see what Bnei Yisrael need and what has to be done. Our picture of holiness, our picture of success is not to be relegated to just that Yisrael, but to be one who's involved in everything. That is one facet of the battle about the Pachim Ktanim. Why would Yaakov Avinu go back for these Pachim Ktanim? Not because stereotyped Jews are cheap. Okay? But there is something to it that Rashi brings down. Sadikim chaviv aleim mamonam. Sadikim, all of their possessions are very precious to them because they all become part of them in their mission. They are all imbued with their essence. And Yaakov Avinu is not going to give up on expressing his spirituality in every physical activity and venue that he's involved in, and so that will be for his children afterwards. So therefore, here, it was an attempt to make him some type of monk, some type of guru, some type of swami who would be up on top of a mountain. You're Yisrael now. You've moved on to the next stage. Hashem says, no. You will be Yaakov, and you will be Yisrael. You will do this, and your children will be able to do the same. So that is one level of it that's very key. The Chasam Sofer points out the following. He says, and again, it gets a little bit mystical. He says that the combination, the gematria, the numerical value of Yaakov and Yisrael together, spelled out with Yaakov with a vav, it comes out Kara Satan. Tear apart the Satan. Right? In Rosh Hashanah we have similar Rosh Tevos that are there. He said this is a name which can defeat all chitzonim, all external forces. Those are what the oppositions are called. He says that's why the Sar Shel Esav did not want to let him have both names. That person who can be Yaakov and Yisrael then is truly able to defeat and to rule. He wanted to relegate him to a certain part of the world. The Kozhnitzer Rebbe, the Mechaim, said that this is basically the people who want to relegate a Jew, a Talmud Chacham, a holy person. You daven, you learn your Torah, you leave what's happening in the world to us. That was what was going on there, what was trying to happen. Another aspect of it. Rav Shapira says that the Pachim Ktanim, these small vessels, represent Jews who are in a very low state. Here's what the argument was. Why would the Malach attack Yaakov Avinu when he goes for these Pachim Ktanim? There was a certain condition which we discussed last week in the brachos, in the blessings that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov. He told Esav, V'aya ka'asher tarid. Kasher tarid means when you will have a justification to cry out and protest the fact that Yaakov got the blessings, meaning that the children of Yaakov will not behave in the way that they're supposed to. Uparaktu lo me'al tzavarecha. You can then throw off the yoke of Yaakov from your neck. So that was a consolation prize. It was not bad, right? That, okay, Yaakov is on top right now, but if the Jews mess up, so then here we go. Yaakov Avinu was not going to let that go. Yaakov Avinu was now taking the struggle a step further. I'm going back for the Pachim Ktanim. I'm going back for those who seem to have no value as Jews. Right? The Kotzker Rebbe said, if you were a fly on the wall, he didn't use that expression, you were watching Yaakov get the brachas from Yitzchak. He's dressed up like Esav. He comes in, he says, Ani Esav b'chorecha. And there are endless questions about why the brachas had to come in that strange way. He says, Yaakov Avinu really didn't need the brachas so badly. Yaakov was a great sadiq. He was okay. But Yaakov Avinu knew that he was the founder of all Jews that would be throughout history. And he was wise enough to know that in history there could be Jews who become so distant from their Judaism that they look like Esav, talk like Esav, and they themselves think that they're Esav. He wanted to get the bracha for them. He wanted to get the bracha for them. That was the power of what Yaakov was doing. So too here. Yaakov Avinu went back for the Pachim Ketanim. He said, I want the brachas to be given not just conditionally to those Jews that are like me. Everyone, even the ones that seem to have no value, that are overlooked by everybody else. And this was the battle. This was what the Sar Shel Esav wanted to fight against, to be able to stop this. Rashi brings down, it's fascinating, the psukim in Hosea that describe this bracha with a few added details. The Navi in Hosea, in Perek Yud Beis, says the following. He says, Babeten akeves achiv, in the womb, Yaakov held on to his brother, Uba'ono, and with his strength, Sarah as Elohim. He defeated a spiritual force. And it continues, Vayasar el Malach vayuchal. He overpowered the Malach and succeeded. Now here it says, Bacha vayitchanen lo. The Malach cried and begged him, saying the following, Beit El yimtzaenu. He will find us in Beit El, v'sham yedaber imanu. And there he will speak to us. This is extra stuff that we don't have in our psukim. What is the Navi saying? He says that the Malach told him, he says, all right, you're asking me for this bracha, right? But let's wait until Hashem will speak to both of us in Beit El. Right? The idea of putting in a delaying tactic. Beit El was, in fact, where Hashem gave that extra bracha. So, again, the Rav Mendel of Kosov explains this a bit allegorically. He says, you know what the Malach says? He cried to him, and he said, no, he says, Beit El yimtzaenu. You'll be in the house of God. Meaning, don't take these Jews. You stay with the Jews who are in shul. You stay with the Jews who are in yeshivas. These are mine. That's the one thing that was left in Yitzchak's bracha, that these Jews are mine. These ones are like me, and they're not like you. And this is where Yaakov fought, and where Hashem affirmed by saying that you will be both Yaakov and Yisrael. Meaning, every single Jew has both of those names. Every single Jew has within him the Yisrael. Let's try to tie it up. The Shem Shmuel said that the ability to defeat the spiritual opposition even of a Malach is if your Neshama becomes dominant. The Neshama becomes dominant when you push the envelope even a little bit, when you break habit, when you do something that's difficult for you, when you try, so then you are going to that level of Yisrael. And all of us have that in our potential at all times. We're able to do it and we can do it. And therefore, says Rav Moshe, that's why the name that's chosen in the statement of Chazal is very key. Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael hu. We define that a Yisrael, you're a Yisrael when you do the sin, you're Yisrael after you do the sin. You are always Yisrael, meaning you can always rise up. You will never be separated and relegated from that. We haven't had stories yet. A couple stories to illustrate this. And there are so many throughout Jewish history. There's a story that I love that happened in the town of Apta, where the Rav was known as the Oiv Yisrael of Apta, the Apta Rav. So there was a tailor in that town. I'll call him official, just picking a nice Eastern European name. It isn't Fyvel. Okay, and he was a tailor in the town. And he was a good tailor, but he was a poor businessman. So he didn't really have his own shop. He would do some odd tailoring jobs. And when he didn't have tailoring, he would help out in the Aptarov's house in Shul, kind of as the fix-it man. One day, there was a shift in the power in the whole region. one Paritz, what they always call a feudal landowner, had decided to sell his holdings to a new Paritz. And suddenly a new Paritz came, moved into the castle, and he sent his servant into the town, and he says, listen, the custom is that when a new Paritz moves into town, you have to invite all the local nobility for a grand dinner at the castle, and I want new clothing for myself, for my wife, for my children, livery for the servants. I need a tailor now. This party's coming soon. So the servant came into town. He went to the more mainstream tailoring shops, and they really wanted the business, but it was too sudden, and they all had a backlog. He said, what am I going to do? My master needs tailoring. They said, listen, this is Guy Fischel. He doesn't have a shop. He's a good tailor, though. Give it to him. So he brought him to the castle, and the Paritz said, okay, let's see how good you are. This is my new material. Measure, make me a suit. And he worked on it furiously. He came back to the Paritz. The Paritz tried it on. He looked in the mirror. He says, you're good. This is gorgeous. He says, I like this. Thank you very much. And he gave him not only his payment, but a tip. So the official went back to the house of the Rav to let him know the good news that he made a few, rubles or kopecks or whatever it was, zlotys at the time. And the Rebbe gave him a shekayach, a bracha. But then suddenly, the servant of the Paritz came thundering into town again, riding very fast on his horse, and he says, the Paritz summons you immediately back to the castle. And he said, oh no, like did the pants split or something? Like what happened? What did I do? So he comes back there, and he's shaking, because it's usually never good in these stories when the Jew gets schlepped before the Paritz. But the Paritz was all smiling, said, it didn't mean to frighten you. He says, I was just thinking, they told me you don't have a shop. I need so much clothing here, all the time, uniforms for the servants, my family, all these things. I have plenty of room here in the castle. Let's set you up a little tailor shop in the castle, and you will be the house tailor. Unbelievable. Me'ashbas yorim evyon. Fischel was in business, and he moved in. A few weeks afterwards, he comes running to the Rav's house, and he is pale as a sheet. He says, Rebbe, I have to tell you something. I said, what's wrong? He says, I was talking to other servants there in the castle. They told me that this Paritz is actually Jewish. He's Jewish. They said he was a Jew who was what's called a meshumad. He converted to Christianity. He married the daughter of some nobleman. And that's him, this guy. So the Rebbe said, listen, there are rumors, servants talk. Check into it. Try to investigate and see and get back to me. He came back not long later. He says, everybody seems to know the story. They know where he's from. They know that he was a Jew. The Rebbe said, if this is so, I need you to promise me something that may be very difficult. He says, what? He says that you will not make any clothing for him that is shatnez, that is made of wool and linen. You must promise this. He says, okay, Rebbe, I will. As luck will have it for our story, right? He comes back to the castle. The Paritz says, I just got a new shipment of some fine new material from France. It's this great new blend, wool and linen, really comfortable, really, all these kind of things. And Fischel takes it, and he puts it on his table, and he doesn't touch it. After a week or so goes by, the Paritz says, why haven't you come to me for a fitting? He says, I didn't make the suit. Why didn't you make the suit? He says, because my rabbi told me I can't make it for you. It has wool and linen. So he grabs him by the arm. He says, we're going to talk to your rabbi. And he goes in his carriage, and he rides into town, and he comes to the Abder Rav's house, and he kicks the door in. And he says, you're this man's rabbi? He says, yes. You told him that he cannot make a suit for me because it has wool and linen? He says, yes. What do I have to do with your laws? So the Rav looked at him and he said, Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael. A Jew, doesn't matter if he sinned. He's a Jew. The Paritz said, Rabbi, maybe you're not with it so much. Let me tell you a little bit about my life. I live in that castle over there. There's a woman I live with, my wife. She's not Jewish. We have kids. Okay? You think it matters to God if I wear wool and linen? Again, he said, Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael. He said, let me tell you another thing, Rabbi. There's a special room in the castle. Special room. It's my own private little church. The chapel. Priest comes every day, and he gives me a special cracker, not the ones you guys eat with herring, another kind, and some wine. And I do that every day. Says, you mean to tell me it makes a difference to God if I wear wool and linen? Again, Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael. And he was shocked. He says, if I would have known that, maybe my life would have been different. Because when I was young, I did some very bad things, and I figured, it's too late for me. Let me get ahead in this world. I converted to Christianity, and I moved on and became what I became. If what you say is true, I didn't have to do that. He says, that's right. And they say that over time, the Rebbe found a way for him to be able to slip away and rebuild his life as a Jew someplace else. So this is the idea. The Yisrael is always in there. That's what it's saying. And the Yisrael can rise up. No matter how dormant it's become, it can always rise up. And the situation can come. And at that moment, the Yisrael rises up, and then it's more powerful than anything. There's a beautiful perush of Rabbi Levine Zatzal. Again, lived here in the neighborhood. I like to quote things from him here in Nachlaot. So I saw this brought in a sefer that someone asked him once a rather strange question. They said, Rebbe, are you one of the 36 hidden sadiqim? Right? There's this concept that there are Lamed Vav hidden sadiqim. He said, are you one of them? You know, so kind of strange situation was, you got to say yes, and he's no longer hidden or something. But Rabbi gave a very unusual answer. He says, maybe sometimes. The man said, what does that mean? He says, I don't imagine the 36 hidden tzaddikim the way you do, that there are these 36 undercover agents out there in the world. He says, what it means is that the world is being held up every second by 36 people who are doing something special. 1 minute it might be me, the next minute you, the next minute something else. This is the idea that when your Yisrael comes out, then you're changing the world in such powerful ways. You're able to overpower physical opposition, spiritual opposition, all these different types of things that are there. One other example of this, a story that took place in Kozhnitzer. Once we quoted the Kozhnitzer Maggid. I found this in something I read once, Holocaust memories, and this was written by a woman who had lived in Kozhnitzer. So she said when the Nazis came into Kozhnitzer, so they took over the city hall as their headquarters, and they took Jewish women and they made them scrub the place. So she said we were on our hands and knees scrubbing the floors, and she said we would actually be kind of singing Shvoch Hamoscha El Hagoyim Asher Lo Yeda'ucha, that part from the Pesach Seder, pour out your wrath on the nations, while we're doing it. And she said then there was this terrible ruckus coming from the mayor's office. She said that the mayor at that time, once again, was a Jew who had converted to Christianity. He came out of his office, the Nazis had dragged him, and he was bloody and beaten, and they had been beating him and screaming at him, where's the money? Where does this Jew hide their money? Where does that Jew hide their money? And they took him out, and they put a Sefer Torah in his arms that they'd taken from the shul. And they told him, throw it on the floor and kick it. And he said, I won't. And they took out a gun and pointed it at him, and they said, throw it on the floor, kick it, spit on it. And he said, I won't. And they shot him and the Sefer Torah. And this woman said that the officer who was in charge did a very strange thing. He said to her, his clothes are still pretty good, shouldn't go to waste, bring them to his wife. And he gave her the man's clothes, his coat, whatever it was, to bring to that house. As she was carrying it, she saw that there was a piece of paper in the pocket. She took it out and read it. It was a letter that the man had written. He says, I went very far from who I was supposed to be, from where I came from in life. I see now that it was a mistake. I hope that Hashem will give me a chance to be able to repair what I've done before the end of my life. That was that Yisrael coming out. And it's always in there. That's the idea. The Pachim Ktanim, the reason or the parallel of the Arizal saying this is the Pach of Hanukkah, every Jew, even the one that seems to be so empty and so worthless, has in him that miraculous oil that is able to overcome nature and to bring a light into the world that's more powerful than any of these others. That ability to go from Yaakov to Yisrael is what the Chasam Sofer said Yetzer Hara was fighting against so strongly. I want to finish with an interesting observation. I heard a lecture once an Israeli researcher. It's amazing what people get their PhDs in. His thesis was studying the connection of the development of comic books in America with Jewish immigrants. Okay, it seems that comic books, superhero comic books as we know them, were started by Jews. Right? Immigrant Jews, I believe one of them was named Shuster actually. I don't think a relative. And Superman especially, right? He was Superman. And he said it's so interesting also that the Germans sensed that there was something Jewish about it, that they outlawed Superman comics and any Superman thing in Germany, and they called it a Jewish comic. He said he feels that the reason the Jews came up with this is there's something deep in the Jewish psyche that understands this image of the Clark Kent, of that Nebish who doesn't seem like much, going around this world without particular status or power, but inside is something far more powerful than anyone could imagine, and is supposed to be releasing those powers for good. It's fascinating that perhaps in the subconscious of this Jew who's writing a comic book, not consciously thinking about it, but that's who we are. That's what we aspire to be. And that's what we know about who we are. And this is what the Malach, on one hand, cried about, but on the other hand, sings about when we are able to bring that forth. That's what's happening in this. We're both Yaakov and Yisrael. We're struggling in this world. We're rising above this world. We have the moments when we can go up, more powerful than any angel. But even when we go down, we never lose that potential, and we never lose that name. Yisrael, afal pi shechota Yisrael hu. And Hashem says about all of Am Yisrael, Yisrael asher b'cha espa'er, you are my crowning glory. That's true about all of us and each and every one. And it's something to remember, especially when coming into Hanukkah. It's a fascinating thing that Jews of all types connect to Hanukkah. Right? Some people are cynical and say it's because there are other holidays in December. But what you see in the Sfarim is that the light of Hanukkah is so powerful. It teaches that, it touches that inside of every Jew and allows them to bring that light out into the world. All superheroes, in one way or another. Have a wonderful evening.